Image selection based on expression. So for today's video, we're going to look at how to set up expressions that will allow a value to be mapped to an image. Ordinarily, within Tahoma or OpenTunes, you cannot choose an exposure dynamically. You can't say at frame 1, I want to expose drawing B instead of drawing A. It has to be all preset up ahead of time. There's a technique around that using expressions such that a value from one of the columns can be used to choose which image to expose in a particular frame. We're going to go over the 5 ways that I know of to do that. Those 5 ways are: hide behind, using the stacking order to hide and reveal from behind other columns. I'll be showing this with a background layer, and then dynamically changing the stacking order of a column so that it will either be hidden behind the background or be revealed in front of it. Second method is scaling. Scaling a column down to 0 so that it's invisible, or up to 100%. Opacity. Using a transparency FX to set the opacity on a column to 0 or 100% so that it's visible. Moving in and out of view. This is the same as sliding a column outside of camera range so it can't be seen, and sliding it back in when you'd like it to be seen. And then there's a different technique which uses a matte to hide a portion of an image on one column, and then sliding the column so that a different portion of that image is revealed behind the matte, through the matte. I'll start off by describing how the selector was done. This selector is the method that I'm using to get values from 1 to 10 to show and hide 10 different images. What I did for the selector is I set up a path, and then I have a column with an image of a button, and I move that button along the path as a visual indicator of how the values would be changing. I set up another column which has the numbers listed on it, showing the range, going through the range. I then set up a formula on an available column where there was an attribute that wasn't being used. On the background, there is the position path value, and if I look in the FX schematic, I can see that there's no path assigned to the background, so the posPath value is actually not used. So I'm able to reuse it in this case. I could have easily put it on another column, like not the selector column, because I am using the posPath value there to move along the path. I could have put it on the selector values column, but I thought of that afterwards, so I had already set it up on the background column. If we look in the timing room, excuse me, look in the timing room at the posPath formula, you can see I've set it up to take the position along the path for column 15, that's the selector. So when that button moves across the path, I'm pulling the value in for that, the position, dividing by 10, adding 0.5 so that I round up, applying the round function so it turns it into an integer. And then I'm using a clamp function because what I was finding is, as I got near the top of the range, it would actually give me a value of 11. So I was getting a range from 1 to 11. And I don't want that on that one value. So I've clamped it so that the minimum value will be 1 and the maximum value will be 10. Now the benefit of putting this formula in an available column like this, and then referring to it from all the other formulas, the other expressions that I'll be doing, is that if I need to make a change to it, I change it in one place here, and it will propagate through all the other expressions that are referring to it. So that's a benefit. It's also making a simpler formula where you see col1.pos shown here. And that would have been this complex formula in there instead. You can see how many characters would be in this formula. It makes the formula harder to read. It also opens up the possibility for a copy and paste problem, an error to be introduced, and be tricky to track it down. It's a lot easier to just spot, am I pulling the position value from column 1? It's easy to spot that in a simplified formula like that versus one that had all this added to it. That's the reason for setting it up this way. Now that I have the value that I'll be using to pick the letter, I'm going to set it up in the first strategy, which is to use the stacking order as a means to show and reveal each letter. The background is at the default stacking order of 0. So whenever I am also at a stacking order of 0, then the layers in the timeline, or the column order in the X sheet, I'll refer to timeline and layers throughout this video because you can just understand that it would be X sheet and columns if you're using the X sheet. So whichever order they are in the layer order of the timeline, that's which one is above another. So background is down at the bottom. So when they're all at the same stacking order of 0, then it goes by layer order to determine which is above another. So if I manipulate the stacking order and I tell Tahoma I want column B to be -1, that puts it behind the background. So regardless of where it appears on the layer order, in the stacking order, it is behind the background. It will be hidden by the background. So the formula is, take my current position of the selector, and if it's equal to 1, then I want my stacking order to be 0, meaning show the letter A. Otherwise, set my stacking order value to -1. You can see where it changes over at frame 11 to become a -1. This is where the A hides and column B is shown. Its stacking order gets set to 0. So this also makes it easy to check the formula results. As I scroll through here, I can see where the zeros end in one column. They pick up in the next column as the next letter is being shown. The way I've set up my demonstration is I do one full sweep of the selector across the value range and then a full sweep back to 0. So that turns out to be 192 frames. So what I've done is I've repeated that 192 frame sequence for the selector 4 times. That covers each of the 4 methods that are using multiple columns. And the method that is just using a single column and sliding behind a mat, I just have that run continuously because it doesn't compete with the other strategies. So what I've got here is the first 192 frames is using the stacking order strategy. And the next 192 frames, it changes over and starts using the scale. So we'll take a look at that next. So the expressions that I use for scale are to take it from a value of 100 as the way to show it, and 0 as the way to hide it. When the scale is set to 0, the column's not visible. So same basic formula, pulling in that value again from the selector. And if it equals 1, then I'm going to set my scale to 100. Otherwise, I'm going to set it to 0. And so you'll see it starts out with letter A, value is 100. Where it changes over to 0, column B takes over. Its value is 100. And so forth. So again, As I scroll down, I can see where it changes to 0 in one column. The next one picks up, changes to 100. And then there are more columns off to the right, up to the 10th letter, J. And as I scroll down, you'll see it gets back to 0 until the A is exposed again. Now I'll point out, I also have to put constants in outside the range of the expression so that it doesn't leave as a default the last value from the expression. That's the default behavior that it does. So I have to add another row, add another constant value so that scale is 100 after that segment of the animation is done. Now the next method that I'm going to demonstrate uses an effects node. So I'll have to scroll over here to the right, and I can show in the effects schematic how there are transparency effects nodes added to each of the columns, and the values of those transparency nodes are set just as values for the attributes of the columns themselves. It's possible to set values, expressions on the intensity value of these transparency nodes. So similar to what we've seen before, we're taking the value of the selector and checking it. If it's equal to 1, this is the transparency FX node that's assigned to letter A. And if it's time to show the letter A, I want my transparency to be 0. I don't want transparency to be in effect at all. And when it's time to hide the letter A, I want my transparency to be 100. And then it picks up in the next, showing column B with 0% transparency. And so that's how the transparency effects node is being used to show and hide the columns. Next, we have moving in and out of camera view. And so that's the last segment of the animation. I scroll down and we can see that the X value is being manipulated for the columns. So pulling the value from the selector, I check to see if it's 1. If it is, then I want my X value to be 0 so that that column is going to be on the screen. When it's time to hide that column, I'm going to move it off screen by giving the X a value of 2000. So by this point within the video, it should be clear that same thing is happening. When one column is to be hidden, the next column is revealed. And now for the technique of using one column with an image that contains different sections that are to be shown. And this is similar to a sprite sheet in a video game where you may have rows and columns of similar characters, or you may have, in this case, letters, all on one image, one column, and there's an effects node for matting out. And so there's a matte layer, which just shows one square. You can see it here. And the idea is you'll slide the column below the matte so that only one section of the column is visible at a time. That's the strategy. So what gets animated after you've set up the effects node and positioned it where you would like it to be, it then remains to animate the movement of the X value. So in our case, sliding it left and right. So I have an all letters column, and I have a formula on there. And starting from its starting position, the letter A would have been over to the left of the screen more. So I slide it over 500 pixels for the A to be visible. And the formula is take my position of the selector, 1 through 10, multiply it by 100, because that's 100 pixels for each of these sections within this image. So between the start of letter A and the start of letter B is 100 pixels. Every time I move 100 pixels, I'm showing the next letter. So it's 1 through 10 times that 100 and subtracting that from the 500 so that the column slides to the left as needed. And that gives us the result, looking for a sliding column behind this little window of displaying it. Okay, that concludes this video on image selection based on expression. You may find uses for it. I'll probably demonstrate something in my own work going forward. But for now, the main goal was just to address this limitation of not being able to animate the exposures of images on a frame. This is a workaround, and it's a technique that can be used. Thank you, and look for me in the next video.